everyone. My name is Lee McTavish. I'm Program Director, Business Programs and Partnerships at the University of Toronto School of Continuing Studies. I want to bid you a warm welcome to today's webinar, Project Management Success Using Cultural Intelligence and Politics. Before I introduce our industry expert and School of Continuing Studies instructor, here's a bit of housekeeping first. Your questions are welcome at any time during our discussion. We'll gather and share your questions throughout the conversation. To ask a question, type in the chat box. To follow us on Twitter, use the hashtag #LearnMore. Now, I'd like to introduce Mark Anglin, MBA and PMP. Mark has over 20 years of project leadership and large-scale software and network experience. He specializes in working with global companies throughout the US, Europe, and Canada. Mark leads Darwin IT Consulting, providing executive IT consulting for more efficient project execution, enabling Fortune 500 corporations to increase project throughput at lower costs to energy, banking, and telecom corporations. A seasoned practitioner, Mark combines global project experience with a real passion for teaching. Mark recently joined our School of Continuing Studies instructor community. Welcome, Mark. Thanks so much for joining us. Technical ability in project management is a foundational skill you need to have. But I understand that companies today are really looking for project managers with exceptional communication skills, or soft skills as they're sometimes called.
Absolutely.
Why is that, Mark?
Well, if we look at the context is Fortune 500 companies, energy, telecom, government, etc., they spend each year tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of years in projects. Projects are what deliver the business value. Opening other offices, reducing costs, developing new features in a product and that sort of thing. If you look at that, any delay at that scale, these tens of millions or $100 millions of capital expense on a yearly basis, delays cost the company a significant amount of money. And so where these skills come into play is absolutely the technical skills are critical. But what we're finding is if we look at the nuanced and communication skills, and specifically the categories of politics and cultural intelligence, they disproportionately impact project success or failure, depending on how project leaders and others are skilled at these type of things. So today, what companies are doing, the Fortune 500, is they recognize the hard skills, the technical skills you mentioned, of project management. They're table stakes, they're given. In fact, you can find that talent off the street very easily. And so what the Fortune 500 companies are doing, and many executives I talk to, is in surveys, they're looking for talent and refined skills in these nuanced communication areas of politics and cultural intelligence.
Mark, that's great background. That sets a wonderful context for our conversation. So let's dive right in. What is cultural intelligence?
So cultural intelligence loosely is, you can see it on the screen there, person's ability to function effectively. Effectively, we might say productively. We all know corporations are after cost efficiencies and productivity gains. That's been my focus with some executives these last few years in the PMO. And they're looking at people to function productively to get work done, using the awareness, sensitivity, and understanding of culture, where culture is loosely defined, but very well defined as the way things are done around here. So one could imagine if you're an engineer or a software developer and you're now working with the accounting group or the sales group to develop some capability, that's a clash of cultures in effect. Sales or accounting do things their way, we in software do things our way. So it's our job as project leaders to understand and become sensitive to the other person's culture and adapt accordingly.
So it's not just the project culture, but it's the team culture, the organizational culture.
Absolutely.
All of these things feed into the overall cultural environment in which a project lives.
Absolutely. And in fact, you hit on something really critical in the cultural intelligence capability that one needs to refine to be successful. And indeed, companies are looking now and testing for that ability. And we'll come back to that. KPMG General Electric, IBM, those types of companies. What makes this levels of complexity with cultural intelligence is in working with different groups, one has to adjust for different groups. And there are subcultures within a company, stated another way. So one has to work effectively with different subcultures, if you will.
Oh, that's good. Mark, let's switch and talk about what are politics in project management?
Politics, a great question, is just nicely and succinctly, it's the unwritten, informal ways of getting work done. So a project manager is always on their heads on the line to get work done. So it's the informal, seemingly unsanctioned or possibly sanctioned ways of getting done. Informal meaning outside of formal meetings, outside of status meetings, outside of meetings where things are documented. It's the informal relationships, etc.
You know, when people hear the word politics, they sometimes think of it as a negative word.
Yeah.
You know, is there such a thing as positive politics?
Absolutely, great question. So here at University of Toronto, we absolutely espouse the positive politics, the ethical ways of going about getting work done productively. And there are many tactics and strategies that people can learn about that are fascinating. There's many, and they're all ethical and positive, and that's important. Having said that, what we do here at U of T is we recognize the reality of negative politics. Some people might say Machiavellian politics.
Right.
And we recognize that's going on as well. So here at University of Toronto, we absolutely openly have that discussion and how one might, in a positive manner, deal with negative Machiavellian politics, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, but it's absolutely not. How do you reconcile those two?
Right. Mark, you've put together a couple of case studies that we're going to explore today to dive into these issues a little bit more fully. Why don't you lead us through the first case study that you have in mind about a business analyst who moves his offices?
Yeah, absolutely. The essence of this is a business analyst, Adam. And what Adam does, he works in an office in Toronto.
He's working for a large project.
Absolutely. He's a business analyst with a very large project. And the Toronto office has a culture of long hours, not overly social, at least on the surface, and we're going to come back to that. Drive. And now Adam's going down to the Kingston office, and Adam's going to work with the Kingston group. And after quite a long time in the Toronto rigid environment, Adam goes down to work with the team, his virtual team up till now. He goes to work physically in the Kingston office. Mm-hmm. And Adam encounters a situation whereby he's working really focused and he has something to deliver to his boss that evening. And what the Kingston office does is invite him. They open up their arms and they invite Adam to a celebration of someone's birthday. And not only was it that, but they set aside 2 hours in the boardroom to do that. Mm. So Adam was quite uncomfortable with this. Oh. He had something to be done. More importantly for all of us, we're all programmed certain ways based on environment, nature, and nurture. Mm-hmm. And Adam wasn't comfortable taking, let alone 2 hours to go to this. So the question became, what does he do?
Right.
So Adam, would you come to this party? Oh, it's 2 hours. Come on in and meet everybody.
So now, just to be clear, is Adam's project manager, that person is still in Toronto?
Absolutely.
Right. So he's on his own now, starting up first day on the job in this new office, and people want to socialize, something he's not very comfortable with.
Exactly.
So what's going through his head? I mean, what do you think he should do?
His programming is telling him, culturally, if you will, to focus on the work. He is a certain way, and he doesn't open himself up to the possibilities of meeting with the group. He knows it's a good thing. So what would be the worst thing to do was not go, because that could be potentially offensive. And if one were to use an extreme case, if you don't follow a customs in various countries around the world doing projects, which I've done, one can be offensive. Eating a very ugly fish in Japan was a hard thing to do, for example. And in the same vein, here in the Kingston office, not going would be offensive.
Yes.
Going for 20 minutes in and out might create a lot of discomfort. So should Adam go for a good hour or so and network? And in fact, that's the right thing to do.
Yeah. If Adam did make a cultural mistake, say he decided not to go, Mark, how could he recover from a cultural mistake?
Absolutely. So that plays into the interesting framework about we all can be culturally ignorant, not be aware of what's expected. And there, right away, we are at the disposal of somebody judging us poorly. through, in a sense, no fault of our own because we just don't know better. But in the end, that's not an excuse. So when one gets trained by these companies, KPMG, IBM, et cetera, to go overseas and work in other countries, one of the things they now are doing to test project managers is they're testing for one's ability to be curious, to be curious about another person's, remember the definition of culture, the way things are done around here?
Yes.
They're training, they're training, but they're testing for people's curiosity to learn about others. And there's various scales, but one might be deemed as either curious and therefore a good candidate to learn about other cultures, which leads to bridging the gap, in this case in Kingston, and forming relationships. And one can think of that in contrast to somebody who's not curious, not wanting to step into a slightly uncomfortable zone. And that is offensive to others, and likely in the long run, they won't be successful working with someone who does something quite differently.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about the project manager in Toronto. Could that person have set up this situation differently?
Yeah.
In order to, perhaps have a smoother start potentially?
Yeah, great question. So the project manager in Toronto, or any leader in Toronto for that matter, could, and typically in large corporations, we all know that interweaving of relationships exists, could put a call ahead. Hey, I've got this person, Adam, coming down. I want you to make him feel at home, help him out. Absolutely. What happens with cultural offenses, if we're not using cultural intelligence, understanding, sensitivity, awareness, those types of things of the way things are done in another place, what happens is initially people can be quite accommodating and just understand that, in this case, Adam doesn't know what to do and that sort of thing. And we're using the example of a birthday, but there could be countless examples where there's a potential for an offense. What happens is if your boss or somebody calls ahead, help this person out, absolutely that works. And here's the key thing. In the long run, however, where the long run might only be about 2 months, in the long run, if Adam were to continue not being curious, not wanting to adjust his behavior, potentially not wanting to adjust his attitude, there will be friction, obviously, and conflict, and things will go down in flames. So short-term air cover, political cover, if you will, introductions, absolutely do it. But in the end, we all, as project leaders and indeed other employees, we have to own learning to develop our awareness, our sensitivity, our understanding of the way things are done in other places.
So many people on projects are working in virtual teams today. Is there sort of any other advice that you might give a project manager working on a virtual team?
Yeah, and I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who, or most people, if not all of them, are working on virtual teams today. There's all sorts of strategies. And in the cultural context, there's various things one can do. Many of us, people online, we've worked with people, could be just across Canada, could be around the world, and we never meet these people. And there's various strategies in play in terms of bridging the cultural gap, if you will. So if you're in Toronto, you might find out that in Calgary they were leaving the office at 4:30 to go biking or out to the hills and that sort of thing. So how to bridge that gap is, I've done this in some very stressful projects. We're about 1.25 years into it and things aren't going very well at all. And that's a perfect time, for example, to bridge the gap by bringing some personal interest into it, by asking somebody, so tell us, what are you going to do this weekend? You're going to go biking. And the strategy there is the more we can see each other on virtual teams, if you will, as people, as a human person, the more we become more understanding, and indeed the sharing of information leads to more of a coming together. That's the short version anyways. Mm-hmm.
Mark, you've been talking about sort of a cultural intelligence framework. So how does somebody, I'm so interested in what you were talking about earlier in terms of learning to be better at this. But how can somebody progress along that framework?
Absolutely. Great question. So again, many corporations around the world.
We may have a slide about this as well.
Yeah. There it is. Many corporations around the world are following this or something quite similar, where in the progression, first of all, I mentioned earlier the measuring for a project manager to lead a global project. That measuring is testing, in effect, our aptitude and desire, our motivation to be curious and to develop along this continuum. And we don't necessarily have to be fully cultural intelligent. Indeed, that can be a hard ask of many of us, myself included. What's more important in these measures that the large Fortune 500 are instilling more and more in testing, if project managers have the aptitude to lead global projects to lead a cross-cultural set of teamwork. Cross-cultural team, by the way, could be an enterprise project that deals with accounting, sales, engineering. Those are all different departments that we know think and act quite differently. So that can be bridging that group. But back to the framework. What the framework is doesn't matter where we are, but the progression, Lee, that you mentioned is we initially could be unaware, but do we have the desire to become aware? That sort of thing, the motivation.
We've got a great question from the audience. I'd like to introduce it now if I could. Should a budget be allocated within a project for cultural intelligence to develop those skills? I think that's what the question is really asking.
Yeah, I think we'd all agree yes. The realities of training budgets these last few years, as many people know, is they're not necessarily there. I know one company, for example, that put the onus on a couple individuals to learn it online. I'm not suggesting that's the best way at all, but that's a reality. And in this course, we deal with reality. Now, having said that, I got trained specifically with large corporations are allocating a lot of money, not only the testing of different PM candidates, but in the selection of those candidates.
Yes.
And then when I've been selected as a PM candidate to run a global project, what's happened is they did invest in a lot of training with not only myself, but a lot of people. So it is happening. Absolutely.
Mark, if you were to sort of summarize sort of the sort of three things that project managers can take away from our great conversation now about cultural intelligence, sort of what would those sort of top three be?
So maybe just the basic is a great one, myself included, just understanding that culture is the way things are done somewhere in the accounting department, in an office overseas, in an office in Kingston, and that sort of thing. So just starting with that triggers our awareness, which following along that progression, that continuum, just following that triggers our awareness that, hey, I need to really start thinking and be aware of how I'm behaving and possibly adapt, which is the sensitivity and then the understanding to meet the other person really on their turf, right? So by contrast, if I were to go into an office in Bangalore and say, this is the way I do software in Toronto and the development cycle there, and I tell them that, one could imagine I'd be thrown out. I don't think I'd be very successful. It's the opposite. I need to adapt quite really fully to them and that sort of thing. So that would be the first concept. The second concept is this cultural framework and the progression that we mentioned, where we're unaware, then we're aware, then we're sensitive, then we understand, that sort of thing along cultural intelligence. And the third item, which we've implied, but we haven't said, is the model whereby in these measurements that if we're unaware and we become aware, what we need to have the ability, and what these tests do in the Fortune 500 is they test our ability to take in new knowledge and forever be testing that knowledge. So for example, I notice so-and-so never speaks in a meeting. And we don't want to form an assumption of why that is, but view a number of meetings for cause and effects, form a hypothesis of why we think that person doesn't speak much in meetings, and then go to a trusted person informally, could be an HR person who supported me in some of my global projects, and ask the question, here's what I'm observing, here's what I think, what is it? You could be right, or I could be quite wrong, and they will happily correct you and guide you. So that's something.
Mark, we've got another great question from our audience. Here it is. If we have a virtual team, what are some of the first few actions we should take when kicking off the project? Great question.
Right. So in the interest of time today, it's consistent with today, what we want to talk about are in the cultural domain, and then we'll maybe move over to the political domain for a second, answering both facets of this question. In the cultural domain is we want to, and indeed corporations are much more open to talking about expectations, and indeed the project manager should define informally before a kickoff meeting, what are the expectations of behaviors and attitudes? Remember, culture is the way things are done around here. Well, the way things are done around here dictate in effect, either consciously or unconsciously for all of us, what we're doing, our attitudes and that sort of thing. So we want to understand and reconcile that. And how we reconcile that is in the kickoff meeting, we openly table the general behaviors, not of a particular individual, but how a certain office or group of people might work.
Like a team charter.
Yeah, absolutely. And how we should accommodate that.
Sounds great,
Right.
Mark.
And then on the political frame, we could talk about that one for a while. But on the political domain, just to give another example in deference to this, it's absolutely a good discussion to have, and companies are becoming more open about the discussion in the political domain. who has influence, different types of influence. So influence isn't just hierarchical. We all understand that. But influence is very much who knows who. We all know that one. And there's probably about 20 different frames of influence we can touch on later. That some of these might be addressed in the kickoff meeting.
Mark, let's switch gears now and move over to that political sphere that we've been talking about, suggesting. I know that you've been thinking about a case study, the Acme Financial Global Accounting Project. And maybe you could give us the highlights of this particular real-life case that you've experienced and help us understand about the importance of politics and project management success.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. This is fascinating. It took place at a financial institution, and like many companies around the world, in the Western world anyhow, they're moving from you accountants out there were moving from a GAAP standard to an international IFRS, it's called, standard. So the business context for that migration, which has big project impact, is companies need to be more accountable in effect for declaration of revenues, for the controls in place across the company, how revenues and expenses are recognized. So that's the business context. So it affects the entire corporation. One could imagine if you're a corporation, 100 million or a billion or 10 billion, it's a very significant project. The systems have to be changed to accommodate the requirements of this IFRS. So that's the business context. The situation you're referring to is we have two very, very interesting people. We have Hassan, who's a VP of IT, who reports to the CIO, who has too much on his plate in terms of what he has to deliver. And then we have Indira, who came in, has done an IFRS implementation at another significant global financial institution. It's still kind of new. Those are scars that people value. So she was paid a lot of money. She was brought in by the CFO to run this project as a program. She reports to the VP of Finance, reports to the CFO. So seemingly a little less powerful hierarchically than Hassan, at least on the surface, I might add. So what happens in a nutshell? Hassan bought into a lot of the project deliverables, who's going to be allocated and get work done, but then he's not delivering on what the sign off of, in effect, the schedule was. This is causing a lot of problems. The project's getting delayed, it's running behind schedule, and it has executive visibility. So in a nutshell, the question is, if you're Indira, who has to deliver on this program, you're reliant on Hassan, who's hierarchically possibly more powerful than you. What do you do? That's the question that we're going to talk about.
Right. So is this sort of issue at hand, is this a result of poor communication with the project sort of fundamentally? Well,
that's a great question. What Indira did is she, like all good project people do out there, is we had a formal buy-in, schedule sign-off of all the work and who's going to be assigned.
Yes.
So that communication on the surface was seemingly very clear. But Hassan's not. He's kind of shying away from that. And in fact, he's not only shying away from that, but he's making now vocal accusations in meetings about, I can't give you this resource I told you because your estimates were so bad. And he's putting some blame on Indira.
Oh.
Okay. So it's getting a little more complex. Excuse me.
So it sounds like there's some politics at play in this situation.
Absolutely. So to that point, Lee, is if we look at politics, we defined it earlier as the informal ways of getting work done. A key dimension of that is self-interest versus the project interest. Self-interest versus the project interest may or may not be aligned. And in this case, between Hassan and Indira, it wasn't aligned. Hassan had work he had to get done. So that adds to the problem.
His behavior actually seems quite strange. I mean, maybe you could talk a little bit more about the seemingly, different power balance. Is there a power imbalance?
Yeah, great question again. So you're hitting, Lee, on an important thing. If we look at things just hierarchically, I might think Hassan's more powerful. He's higher up in the org chart. He's closer to the C-level suite, that sort of thing. But one of the strategies that Indira might do to kind of bridge this gap is, in a consultative fashion with Hassan. He's clearly very brilliant and bright in what he does. Is in a consultative fashion, and Indira should gracefully kind of imply and maybe a little explicitly let Hassan know why she's there and how she got there. Hassan might not know that the CFO brought her in. Hassan might not know, and this is new information, She worked on a steering committee at the executive level to define the strategy for the company for 18 months.
Okay.
So she got kind of connected, right? So some of these can play into, she might gracefully want to let Hassan know that in a very graceful manner, so Hassan sees her slightly more as an equal, frankly.
We talked about positive politics earlier. You know, how would positive politics play out or look like in this particular situation?
Okay, great question. So one can have different interpretations, but there's a gray area. But generally, on the surface, Hassan's acting ethically. He's serving his self-interest, which we all do to get work done in projects and that sort of thing. And he's not necessarily harming anyone, except for making a couple negative statements in meetings about Indira and the project, how it was set up specifically. So not about Indira as a person, but how the project was set up. So generally ethical, not ethical, and that sort of thing. So the positive politics is for Indira to recognize that and not start the spiral downwards. But again, in a consultative fashion, emphasizing in a graceful manner, I repeat, kind of her connections, her network, that sort of thing, possibly using humor, possibly talking to Hassan about understanding him as a person outside of work, trying to find commonalities and that sort of thing. Being honest and truthful and direct. The higher up you go, it's better and easier to do that. And by being honest, truthful, and direct, which I think Indira needs to be in this case with Hassan, those are all about 7 positive political things that can be done, or stated another way, 7 or 8 positive influence tactics that she could use to get, hey, Hassan, come on side.
Is there something that that she could do with respect to her sponsor, the project sponsor?
Great question. So you're thinking, what were you thinking in particular?
Well, I was thinking about the structure of the project, that Indira reports to the vice president, I think you said, of the CFO.
Yeah.
And so he's on one side, and Hassan is under the, under he's on the technical side.
Exactly.
And so, to implement this kind of a project, both of these departments have to work together.
Yeah.
But if she's reporting up one way, what kind of a dotted line does she have to Hassan? I mean, would they ever think of a co-sponsorship situation with such a impactful or big project that has so much importance to the company's success?
Yeah, great question. So in effect, when you get to this level, the C-suite, in this case the CFO and the CIO, are working a lot, and that's typical in everyone out there in the corporations they work. Escalation is a standard strategy one uses to work through the different conflicts with resources, et cetera, and that sort of thing. Something that's really important here is I emphasized a few minutes ago about Indira should take a direct and honest approach, and that's a positive politics, a positive influence thing.
Yes.
It's well understood through studies at Harvard as well as experientially for all of us out there. If one chooses to take the negative path, so in this case, in the context of your question, if one chooses to really escalate and go up and say, really, you got to get Hassan on side, and especially if Indira was to do that formally in the C-suite in a meeting, right, that would be an offense to Hassan. The direct and positive way is to table it with Hassan, say, we got to work through this. The older you get, that's easier to do, and as opposed to sidelining Hassan and that sort of thing.
Right. What kind of strategies can a project manager take to sort of avoid this conflict at the beginning?
Great question. Training, I mean, many strategies. Training, all the influence techniques. I know myself, it's a long evolution. So I don't want anyone out there thinking that either, geez, can I change my stripes in a day? Or does Mark think you can change your stripes in a day? Absolutely not. Can you change your stripe over a few years? Absolutely. And by way of example, one has to be educated, one has to learn these techniques, but one in the end has to take time to evolve them. So in my case, to make that kind of practical for everybody out there, I was a gnarly software person that kind of didn't really talk too much to people. And I liked my Led Zeppelin in the old days with my Discman, for those of you who remember that. Didn't really want to talk. And I figured out over time, compared to another gentleman, Grant spent a quarter of his time just being with people, having fun and networking. And I remember looking, Grant, you're not being productive at all. What I found out is he rose up to be quite high. He invested the time. So I've learned some of the tactics over many years to, if I don't feel like talking, I learn to, you still got to engage people, etc. So,
Mark, we've got a great question from our audience. How does a project manager resolve team conflicts to make the project successful?
that we could talk about that for a day. But so in the context of this today, we're talking about cultural intelligence and politics. Let's talk about it in those two frames is the logical way to approach that question. So in the cultural intelligence frame, one should look to see if indeed there's some sort of trigger, root cause, if you will, that is a difference in culture. And so where that maybe makes more practical sense to everybody out there is if values are different, okay? If beliefs are different, if attitudes are different, if those things are different, that's going to cause conflict. So to make this very practical, if two people have two very different values, so if person A wants to work 16 hours a day and is sending us emails at 1 in the morning and again at 5:30 in the morning, person B is family oriented, leaves the office at 5. Those are two sets of values. It's important to recognize no one's right or wrong here. There has to be no judgment. But instead, to the point about conflict, it's important to understand, identify the value clash and somehow figure out a way to work towards that. And there's ways to do that. That's the cultural frame. The political frame to your question in terms of cultural conflict in a project, a lot harder. What it can be is, in effect, we want to try and approach it. There's two categories. The first, we want to approach it in a very positive political way, using influence and everything at our disposal. But like all of you out there, I too have tried that sort of thing and it hasn't worked. So consistent with what I said about 20 minutes ago, here at U of T, we have some great conversations around what about reality when someone's just not playing ball with us? So we'll talk about that. And there's things one can do in terms of maintaining a respectful relationship and moving things along. To give practicality to that, you might have two people that just don't talk, period. And what's interesting is if person A, who doesn't talk to B, but they're dependent on each other in the project, they work together. If person A sends an email to person B and saying, I need this from you, I need information from you, etc. So I'll ask the audience for you to reflect on for 5 seconds is person A sends the email to person B. They don't talk. They don't get along. I need this from you. What do you think person B does? Does person B just ignore the email? Do they delete the email? Do they act on it right away? You think about that for a minute. The right answer, studies have shown both, again, experientially as well as psychobiochemistry, psychology and biochemistry is when that person B receives that email, because person B doesn't get along with person A, it triggers a very violent reaction of stress in person B. And what they found is person B will actually answer the email right away to reduce their stress, or in the psychology terms, reduce their dissonance. So there's ways people who don't get along can work together, and we talk about many of those examples in the course.
Really, really interesting points there, Mark. We've got a great question from the audience. Does working in a non-profit versus for-profit organization or company influence an individual's? I'm wondering if you could just help me see the entire question. So does working in a non-profit versus for-profit organization influence an individual's capacity to develop cultural intelligence in projects?
So if I understand the question, my interpretation of that is, are the environments quite different between non-profit and profit, such that one or both environments can enable the development of CI? Is that the question? If I understand the question.
I think that's the question.
Okay. If I understand that correctly, so probably two components to that, 3 components in effect. So the model works is how can we as individuals develop our cultural intelligence, and that can be at our own initiative. Hopefully the company will train us, but that's up to us to do. We have to be respectful of all different types of people, and we need to own that. The second of the third components is the organization itself. To what extent does the organization provide support, training, etc., leadership, lunch and learns, all sorts of methods to promote the awareness and the development of all of us as employees along that progression or continuum of cultural intelligence. The third piece of that is what's really out of all our control is, and I suspect it's the same in both nonprofit, as I haven't worked there, as it is for profit, is the other person. So the framework is us as individuals, the corporation, and then the other person. And so if the other person doesn't buy into being open to learning about another's way of doing something, being open to trying that new way, that's a tough one, right? So those are the three variables at play. The degree to which they're supported nonprofit, I cannot comment on. What I can tell you, and I've mentioned it 2 or 3 times, is for Fortune 500 companies, I mentioned KPMG, GE, there's many, many more that are, there's banks I won't mention that are implementing this. So they are helping. And they expect that person who I mentioned a minute ago who doesn't play ball, better play ball.
This is great advice, Mark. One of the questions we had a moment ago from our audience was, is there an element of sexism in the situation that you've been describing? Is that an influencing factor? And if that is established, if that's part of the situation, how would Indira deal with that?
That's a tough one. Sexism is something that has to be called out right away. I don't claim to be an expert on this, but in the research I've done and also working with some CIOs and that sort of thing, this has been discussed. And it's obviously completely intolerable. It is something that has to be addressed right away. I mean, that's the extent I can speak of. I have a framework. We don't tolerate it. We openly call out people who exhibit that type of thing without exception, I might add. So whereas many of us know the model of conflict management, if person A and person B have a little issue with each other in the project, it's better just come together in a room and talk about it. Don't escalate if you don't have to. It's the opposite with sexism. If you see a certain behavior, if you see where behavior is attitude, behavior is words that are said, etc., it needs to be called out right away, openly.
We have another question from the audience, Mark. Subsequent to the opportunity for a project manager to influence and collaborate with a team member, maybe you could just who is not delivering on their commitment, what is the best approach to handle this?
So great question. So this gets into the first default in a positive political way or positive influential way is to try and work with the person. And you all know, I've used 2 examples where we recognize in this course cases where it just doesn't work. So a few minutes ago, I mentioned person A and person B don't even talk. Yes. We'll talk about that. But the first default is absolutely try and work that through. And what the PM is typically dealing with in all the corporations these days when I talk to people, et cetera, it's all around resources. So somebody who doesn't come to the table to do their work, more often than not, there's a good reason for it. They have other obligations to other stakeholders, probably more senior to me as a project manager, for example. So what that is table it with the individual, ideally just say what's causing the problem, being honest and direct as the open, and then getting the managers together and work it through. And so in the last few companies I work with, these are escalated regularly. In fact, one of the largest telecom companies in Canada, the senior VP of IT, I'll ask the question to the audience. What percentage of the day do you think that the senior VP of IT at a large corporation, like a telecom company, deals with escalation? 20%? 30%? Any thoughts? About 80% of the day is dealing with escalations. And typically it's resource-based. But your first default should not be to escalate.
Okay. I think the question we had a moment ago was really around how do you escalate properly and effectively. So, Mark, maybe you might just help us think that through a bit. You're faced with a situation and you're wondering to escalate or not. Are there some guidelines?
Absolutely. So lots of scars and experience here. So generally the model is table it with the person. We don't have enough time these days. If they're not showing movement towards you to work it through, yes. Table it with this person. In my next steering committee, I've got 30 minutes with the executives. I need to escalate this, and your name's the first bullet list. I don't want to do that. Can we work this through? Can you give me some commitment, even if it's a delayed? So then they got to play ball or not. And you're being honest. You're being direct. Because don't forget our project managers, right? Being a really nice person in PM doesn't necessarily work all the time. In fact, you get trampled on.
Right.
So by that, this bridges the gap. You don't want to be an evil person because you won't have relationships. You can't be a wimp because nothing will get done.
Yes.
So the obvious middle ground is to table it with the person going, I need to escalate your first bullet list in my steering committee with the executives. I don't want to do that. What do we do?
Right. And that comes back to the positive politics and the ethics that you were talking about right at the beginning.
Absolutely.
We've got another question from the audience. Starting a job in a new organization, should we put in effort to learn the office politics, or should we focus on not getting involved in politics? And maybe you can scroll that a little bit more for me.
Concentrate on work.
Should we focus on not getting involved in politics and concentrate on work?
Great. Great question. In the course, we do a little case study interactively with everybody. And there's 4 characters. There's basically Abraham Lincoln, who's the really honest, direct approach. There's Bugs Bunny, who's that sly character who's not necessarily honest, who loves politics. Remember, if you saw the movie, Abe Lincoln deals with politics direct on. Then there's the person with their head in the sand. They know it, which is what this question's getting to.
Yes,
they know it's going on. They're aware of it, but they put their head in the sand. And for the purpose of today, again, both experientially as well as many studies, Harvard Business Review, Economist, Forbes magazine, many academic journals, but we want to make this practical. The reality is, coming back to how we started out, Lee, is executives are looking for people who can display positive politics, which means influence, cultural intelligence, and that sort of thing. And in fact, if you go look, if you were to go Google after this and go start looking at job descriptions for program managers, but also project managers in New York, Chicago, some in Toronto, what you're starting to see is, to your question, you're seeing explicit lines, item skills, the ability to network through the organization quickly. So they're recognizing there's politics to the question.
Yes.
Putting your head in the stand is not the way to go.
It's not the answer.
Yeah. And in the long run, it's too important of a skill now.
Right. But knowing that it can be positive politics, I think it means we can all be heartened by, our ability to be successful doing that.
Absolutely. And to underscore that point, Lee, that you just said, one of the Harvard Business Review studies was, again, brought in experiential examples with executives and that sort of thing, was there are really 4 attributes that determine all our long-term career success. And for the purpose of today, if we're honest, honesty and sincerity are key characteristics that dictate our career success, which is intuitive. Because if one were, for example, if I were to lie to you or offend you or do something Machiavellian or mean to you in a project so I can look good or get ahead, right, you're going to remember that. And one could imagine that then when Lee becomes the CIO of a company at another company, because of what I did to her, she's not going to call me over to be a program manager over there. So that's why the honest, ethical way is the way to go.
Take the long view. We've got another question from the audience. We've heard that culture eats strategy. What can we do to ensure our organizational culture fosters project success instead of hindering it? Great question.
So culture eats strategy. So I'm not going to assume what that is because I just don't know. What can we do to ensure organization culture?
I think it means that culture, if it's not sort of dealt with in a positive way, it can derail your strategy.
Oh yeah, okay.
That's how I was interpreting that question.
Yeah, okay. So that's interesting. So what can we do to ensure culture fosters project success? This is this plays into some very key things. There are things we observe. The formal ways of doing things. We observe the informal way. Who knows what? Who scratches each other's back? Who stays at 7:30 at night? Who goes out with people to get work done? Favors for each other and that sort of thing. And that's all, is done in an ethical way. That's getting work done, which project managers, of course, are responsible for. So what can we do to ensure organization culture fosters project success? In a nutshell, and I think we've talked about it on and off a few times now, for a placeholder today is learn these strategies, come to the course, learn all this good stuff, and be actually an ambassador and execute on your own all these ethical, positive ways to get your work done, which does ensure the organizational culture.
Some of the things we've been talking about, Mark, makes me think of politics increase when resources are more scarce.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's that. They're sort of really entwined.
Yep.
I don't know if there's sort of anything that you can help us think about as project managers to help us, navigate that successfully.
Well, a few things come to mind. In terms of the scarce resources, which all companies are dealing with now, scarcity breeds politics, both good and bad. Machiavellian negative politics,
Yes.
as well as positive politics. And indeed, the gentleman or lady who asked the question a little earlier about can I avoid politics, in effect, the head in the sand? Mm-hmm. This is a perfect example that, given how often resources are an issue, basically all the time, that's a perfect example where we can't put our head in the sand. We have to be an advocate for ourselves and push with grace, but push on these influencing ways, working things, ingratiation, networking, consultative approach, rational approaches, technical cost benefit, explanations to people, emotional appeals could be. There's all sorts of ways that we talk about in this course on what we want to do.
Really increasing the communication overall.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Mark, we have time for one more question, and we've got one from the audience. How would you deal with a team member who is not contributing because of a confidence issue versus lack of knowledge? Interesting.
Well, the lack of knowledge, let's deal with the easy one first. The lack of knowledge, where I am today working with the executives of a large energy company, that exists. And without giving any proprietary information away, we are doing on-the-job development of their skills now. So that the days of classroom training hopefully will exist for years, and they're needed. What's needed to complement classroom training, the theory, is the coaching on the job and bringing them along.
Yes.
So as a PM, easier said than done given the time limitations, but really, and this is what I'm doing now, I'm leading the whole PM, all this PM group, and I'm expected by my CIO that if I'm asked or if I see something wrong, to proactively get in and help on the lack of knowledge. So what does lack of knowledge means? In a nutshell, for the purpose of today, how does a BA define the scope? How does a system analyst do an activity diagram, a sequence diagram, or something like that? So I need to show them. The non-confidence issue, that's a big topic. Why don't we come back to that later?
Okay, good. Well, Mark, I want to thank you so much for sharing all your insights and around cultural intelligence and politics. We've had a really fascinating conversation today, and I'm just so glad you could join us on this front. You've really shared a lot of information that's been most helpful.
Thank you.
Project management jobs are growing like crazy worldwide, and we know that people with these skills and skills with people that are skilled at communications, that have this great ability for nuanced and sophisticated communication, these are the people that are going to be successful and move ahead getting jobs. So these people are in big demand.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, I reference, you're seeing job descriptions. They're openly and explicitly asking for people who can influence people, who can network, etc. Absolutely.
And to our audience, I want to thank you so much for joining us on this webinar. As you know, the School of Continuing Studies has a wide range of courses in the project management area, all recognized by the Project Management Institute. We have courses for people that are just starting out on their project management journey, and we've got courses for people that are more experienced and that are looking for ways to hone their skills in more advanced areas. We have industry experts like Mark who teach all of our courses in project management. You may want to consider completing a project management certificate with us at School of Continuing Studies and work towards a Project Management Institute designation at the same time, such as your PMP, for example. Visit the school's website to learn more about our 4 project management certificates, or our PMP prep courses, and our almost 600 courses that are 60 project management courses that are recognized by the Project Management Institute for Professional Development Units, or PDUs. Signal your professionalism to employers and bring that kind of confidence to the job market. These kinds of credentials can really help on that front. So register now. Courses are starting in May, June, and July. visit us at our 3 campuses, the Mississauga campus, the downtown or St. George campus, and our Scarborough campus. Our online courses, of course, make it easy for you to fit your studies into the spring and summer period. And on a final note, in closing, we would love to hear your thoughts on today's discussion. You'll receive an email with a link to this webinar, along with a 2 quick question survey. We hope that you'll give us feedback because we'll use this to develop future webinars. So I want to thank you today for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.